This video I think I can make reasonably brief. It'll still be long enough. But if we can get everything in this video across that we need to get across, we can just have this one and then I'll have one more asking you to listen to a poem that's of significant importance in the 1950s. We'll start, though, with a German philosopher named Martin Heidegger. Heidegger's most well-known text, titled Being and Time, I won't bother much with. It's a text that's nearly incomprehensible, but the ideas expressed can be understood in a relatively straightforward manner. Basically, this complicated text attempts to make the argument that we as human beings are thrown into the world, and then only once we're here, after we're here in existence, can we try to make sense of the reason why we are here. This is expressed by the concept in German Dasein, D-A-S-E-I-N, Dasein, meaning their being. For Heidegger, that is the human condition, one of being thrown into the world, and then, once we're here, trying to make sense of our existence in it. But I would like to take just a moment longer with a text called The Question Concerning Technology. In this text, we have a philosophy of technology, which is not something we had dealt with often, or really since an early discussion at the beginning of the semester. Heidegger's claim here is that technology has an essence, and that essence is primarily twofold. Technology takes something that exists, usually in nature, something like a river, perhaps, and it makes a challenge of that river. It challenges the river to become a source of power. The way that it does that is by putting a box or a frame around that thing in nature and sort of titling that viewpoint we have power. So we take something that exists and we try and turn it into a power source. The way we do that with a river is to dam it up. And in that way we have agricultural power, hydroelectric power. We can stock the reservoir with fish. But what we've done is we've transformed something that exists into something like a battery to be tapped on demand for our purposes, making it cease to be something natural and become something that is useful. This same process occurs when we take a cow and ask that cow to become a power source. Hook them up to a plow or to a cart, or put them through the factory farm and turn them into a hamburger. Put it in the freezer, thaw it on demand, and we have literal power at the ready. The most interesting implication of Heidegger's philosophy of technology, then, is that the technology may then be applied to us, and we will become like that river, like that cow, a battery, a source of power. Consider if you work. Your place of employment likely has a Department of Human Resources. Think of the other things we call resources. Forests, fisheries, petroleum reserves. Resources are things to be used, exploited even. That is the danger of the application of technology to humanity. Perhaps like Neo in the Matrix, in the movie from a previous decade. We will become power sources, batteries, to feed some nefarious machine. But the insight is that it's not some futuristic sci-fi machine that we serve as batteries to be used up and exploited until we're a wasted husk and we're replaced. That's not something other than what we experience right now. The idea of you as cog in the machine, a Marxist sort of idea, is that the economy will plug you in, take everything it can from you, and when you're an old, dried up, useless old husk, we'll replace you with somebody new, in the same way that you take the batteries out of a remote and replace them when they're dry. For the river, for the cow, and for the person, what technology does is it takes something beautiful in nature and demands of it become a battery. And there's a question as to whether that's good when it's applied to us. If we lose our humanity and become mere cogs in the machine, when we allow ourselves to be a part of the technological, industrialized economy. Perhaps you've had the experience of working in retail or some other significantly similar soul-sucking, soul-crushing field. And you know what it's like to be used. This is an element of technology that Heidegger is identifying, something to be criticized for Karl Marx. And the poem that I mentioned at the outset today will also deal with that aspect of capitalism, simply put. These criticisms are a part of the intellectual milieu of this time. So as we go forward, let's see how they play out. Before we leave off Heidegger, though, he ends the text, the question concerning technology, with a quotation from a German poet named Hölderlin. And the quotation, translated into English, says, "Where the danger is, grows the saving power also." If we were to take that quotation and apply it to a technological problem, such as climate change, and in that sense, I mean, climate change is a problem resulting from our technologies, it makes it sound like we might be able to solve our problems of technology with a technological solution, a technological fix. The question there, I think even more profound, is can technology save us from the ravages of technology? And that's not a question I intend to answer, but one I more intend to leave you to ponder over. When we look at the 20th century, you see we have a glut of philosophers to address. We'll begin addressing them this week, finish next week, carrying ourselves into our own time period, connecting up the beginning of the universe, the history of the world, the evolution of humanity, the origins and history of human civilizations, right up until the present moment. And that's an exciting thing and a privilege I've had to work with you. So let's finish it out. The poem I was discussing is titled Howl. There's a couple of movies that have been made about this poem and its surrounding elements. One similarly titled Howl, starring the pleasant actor James Franco as Allen Ginsberg, and another one starring Daniel Radcliffe, the young man who played Harry Potter in all those movies, called Kill Your Darlings. I recommend each of these. The first one provides a dramatization and visualization of the poem. The second one provides some background and context to what influenced and informed the poem. I'm going to ask you to listen to and read the poem, but I want to give you some indication of what you're in for. Perhaps let's start with the obscenity trial and the homosexual themes. Written in 1955, the poem Howl ultimately ended up before the Supreme Court because people wanted to censor its publication, making the argument that it was nothing more than pornography and smut and obscene, because it had a number of homosexual themes, themes of drug use, and regular profanity, and quite shocking profanity. The Supreme Court did ultimately determine that the poem had redeeming artistic and literary merit. And I think you'll find that too. Those profane and explicit homosexual references Ginsberg sets up as a juxtaposition against images displaying the excesses, perversion, greed, and destruction present in 20th century industrialized capitalism. In the second part of the poem, Ginsberg uses the image Moloch to represent the excesses, greed, and destruction of capitalism, the American military-industrial complex, and a repressive, conservative, puritanical morality, all represented in 1950s USA. Moloch is a Babylonian bull-headed deity, perhaps something between a minotaur and a golden calf. And when you hear and read the poem, you'll see Ginsberg using it as a stand-in for the idol, I-D-O-L, that capitalism, the worship of money and military, represents. While the first part of the poem is a repetitive, chant-like stream of consciousness, exploration of the American experience, of the Beat generation. The third part of the poem references the death by suicide of a close friend in real life of Allen Ginsberg. The character in the poem referenced in the third part is a man Ginsberg had a homosexual crush on and a short fling relationship with. And this person seems to have been bisexual in a time where both homosexuality and bisexuality were forbidden in the context of 1950s prudent morality. And so, while this love-lorn love affair is already taboo, the promiscuous young man Ginsberg has an attraction to, for one reason or another, finds himself caught up in the middle of a murder investigation and likely associated with the repressive attitudes towards homosexuality, winds up in a mental institution for the criminally insane, where he's treated with electroshock therapy in order to literally electrically shock the gay out of him. This is a form of gay conversion therapy. And from what I can tell, the young man's homosexuality and criminality were conflated with the idea that with enough electrocution, they could cure him of his gayness and supposedly move on to the criminal elements from there, whatever they may have been. And so, the end of the poem, Ginsberg references a mental institution called Rockland, where his friend was at. And the story ends with Ginsberg's crush being treated with so much electroshock therapy to supposedly cure him of his gayness that it ultimately drives the young man to suicide, which crushes Ginsberg. The question of obscenity in Ginsberg's critical poem Howl is a fascinating aesthetic question, because it allows us to ask, what is more obscene? Is it gay sex that's so dirty and immoral? Or is it war, greed, prejudice, and hate that's more obscene and more immoral? The society thinks it's the former, and by implication, Ginsberg is displaying it as the latter, and trying to display artistically the immorality and consequences of prejudice, greed, war, and hate. So, I hope you will enjoy the poem. But let's move on a bit further into the 20th century before we finish out this video. Ayn Rand serves as an interesting discussion. Her philosophy is regularly despised by people, and not necessarily for the best reasons. Ayn Rand, even in the context of her personal or philosophical flaws, strikes me as a sort of intellectual brainchild of Friedrich Nietzsche. She is attempting to articulate an argument that selfishness, instead of being immoral, is a virtue. We see that in texts like The Virtue of Selfishness, and expressed also in novel form in The Fountainhead, Anthem, and Atlas Shrugged. She terms her philosophy objectivism, with the idea that objectively, self-interest is a universal starting point, and that failure to recognize the universal self-interest of people will make it impossible to understand how the world truly works and how morality should best be understood. That argument by itself can be evaluated on its own merits. Objectivism is not without flaws. Selfishness, as a moral good, can be debated for or against. And that's not my interest here, because that's not what I find so interesting about Rand's philosophical approach. Instead, it's Rand's willingness to be assertive and willingness to think for herself and willingness to express unpopular ideas. For example, an explicit criticism of the concept of the social contract, as well as the necessity of taxation. When we discussed Thomas Hobbes, I don't think we discussed a primary criticism of social contract theory, which Ayn Rand's critical insight makes more plain. Simply, what she argues is that unless taxation is voluntary, there is no way it can be ethical. Simply put, Ayn Rand is questioning the entire foundation of contemporary political society. It had been unquestioned that taxation is fine. What Ayn Rand argues is that if I make $100 or $1,000, or if you make $100 or $1,000, that personal property is and should be an absolute right, and that no person with a gun has any right other than the right of a bandit, which is an immoral one and not a right at all, to take that money away from you through thuggery. Perhaps you can begin to see why she is such a reviled figure. You'll see more as we continue. Ayn Rand's philosophy, for that reason, has been referred to as a type of voluntarism or voluntarism. It's the idea that taxation, to be ethical, should be voluntary, or must be voluntary. That unless I have the choice either to give or not give the government my money, that it is necessarily theft, thievery, and without merit, even if it were supposedly for good forces, for good purposes. In that sense, her philosophy has been come to be identified with what's called libertarianism. That individual liberty rights are and should be absolute. I mentioned her criticism of the social contract, but I didn't make it clear. What Ayn Rand has the insight to point out that no one had previously is that there is no contract. None of you, nor did I, ever sign an agreement that in exchange for paying my taxes, the government would offer me the protection of a military and a police force, and laws and courts. I never had the ability to opt in, nor to opt out of that supposed contract. Imagine if you went to a local car dealership and you had the option of signing a contract to pay your money in exchange for a car, or choosing to walk away and not buy anything and not sign a contract. Imagine if, when you tried to walk out of the dealership, the car dealer put a gun to your head and said, "No, you are going to buy this car. We are going to give it to you, and we are going to take your money for it. You don't have a choice." What Rand helps to point out is that the social contract is not a contract because it's not free. Instead, we are all coerced by threat of physical violence. And instead of society being voluntary, opt-in, or libertarian, as it's come to be called, it's a society of blackmail. Now, the question for voluntary taxes or an opt-in society is that practical? And I don't have an answer for that. No intention, no ability to answer. Instead, I'll leave you to mull over its a necessary and unavoidable evil. If her criticisms, while appropriate, lack a suitable solution, or how to parse those critiques. But for better or worse, she's probably right on the analysis. Perhaps, like Marx, she's wrong on the solution. I don't know if I've pointed this out yet, but now would be a good time to understand that practically every single philosopher turns out to be wrong. What we at least hope for in our philosophers is that they're wrong in a useful way. And perhaps at the very least, Ayn Rand might fit that bill. Although she's not ever credited as being a member of a feminist movement, and probably wouldn't have wanted to be, and there are good reasons not to, Ayn Rand is an assertive, confident, courageous, critical thinker, following in the footsteps of Nietzsche and carrying on her own criticisms and own ideas. She hopes, from the ground up, to create a new philosophy, much as Nietzsche had expressed, for example, in the Three Metamorphoses. And even if, in retrospect, or in the context of her philosophy itself, we have good reason to criticize her, those endeavors, especially coming from someone who doesn't have the benefit of the privileges men receive in intellectual history, likely are noteworthy and shouldn't be too hastily overlooked. I did want to spend a moment on one of her late works, titled For the New Intellectual. Many of Rand's works are very long and very dense, but For the New Intellectual is short, easy, and a pleasure to read. Her idea is that it sums up a significant part of her philosophy. And while I couldn't find a free online version for you to look at, I would encourage you, if you're interested, to go purchase a copy yourself. Because the arguments she makes are compelling and largely of a different sort and more explicit than we see her making in her earlier texts. She has the benefit of age, hindsight, and wisdom. But she's no less critical, as you'll see. She makes the argument that society is run by a combination of people she calls witch doctors and Attilas. The witch doctors are politicians, economists, and priests. People who use voodoo magic to try and rule the people around them, but have nothing but hocus pocus at their command. And these witch doctors, politicians and priests, make an alliance with Attilas, or warlords. And these would be simply the military and the police. And I warn you, the following argument will not strike many people as pleasant or generous. The way Rand puts it is that the military and the police are people who make nothing of value, but create a career out of taking from people who do make things, or destroying what people who do make things make. These are people who make their living through the force of their arms, and as she puts it, lack any sort of moral compass, which in her arguments, the witch doctors, politicians, and priests exploit for their own purposes. These two groups need each other. The witch doctors, politicians, and priests need people to enforce their ideas, their laws and commands, and to protect them from the people at large, because the politicians and the priests are cowards. But they employ strong men who are more than happy to make violence on their behalf. And the Attilas, the warlords, military and police, want to be able to make a life through violence, but they need some way to justify it. And so the politicians, the priests, give them enemies. Enemies they can take things from, destroy, maim, and hurt, and call it moral. Consider the American military in this context. Consider the war on drugs in this context. I don't think Ayn Rand is perfectly correct, and I think she's probably overly mean in this analysis. But, at least in part, she may have some small bit of insight, and it is a frightening insight. At the very least to be considered, and if it can be contradicted, to be contradicted. She argues that instead, society would be better run not by this unholy alliance of voodoo doctors and warlords, but instead should be run by philosophers, scientists, and business people, those who actually make things of value. And if you read Ayn Rand, I don't think she'd find Donald Trump her ideal business person. She, without question, has in mind an Elon Musk, someone with business acumen and scientific genius, not somebody rich who makes money off of money. Imagine what difference it would make if our society, instead of being run by people who make nothing, employing people who destroy, instead, scientists, people who are thoughtful, intellectual elite, and people who are interested in improving the world through human ingenuity. You can parse out, criticize, or see insight or flaw in her arguments in thousands of ways, I'd bet. But because I cannot think of a single other person in the history of ideas who makes these arguments, I find them worthwhile to investigate together here. Let's deal as briefly as possible with Albert Camus, the existentialist, and Jean-Paul Sartre, and call it a day. Albert Camus is an interesting philosopher who dies at a young age, and whose philosophy is extraordinarily dark and pessimistic. We call it absurdist. I'll try and make clear why and how. But before we do, let me give some indication of his style. I think the text titled "The Stranger" gives the best example of that. Written in 1942, The Stranger is a strange text to have won a Nobel Prize for Literature, because it's a short, straightforward, rather simple text in which there's no apparent plot, or at least no apparent rhyme or reason to the plot, where things happen seemingly at random, for no reason, and then before it seems like the book should be over, it ends too soon. This is actually Camus' philosophy of life, that life is a random, meaningless chain of events that bear no rhyme or reason to one another, and before it seems like life should be over, it ends too soon, just as Camus does in real life. The story of The Stranger is a man who in the opening scenes has to attend a wake, which is a type of vigil, for his recently deceased mother. A wake is where people sit around all night waiting to see if a dead person will wake up. And what you would notice is that in the modern context, this is a futile endeavor. The reason why is that the woman is dead. She's not going to wake up. So the action is futile in the sense that it's useless. Futile, spelled F-U-T-I-L-E. Futile, meaning useless or pointless. The main character describes sitting around all night with a bunch of smelly old folks in a very unpleasant, annoying situation. And then finally, when the vigil is over, to get the sort of bad taste of the experience out of his mouth, he decides to go out to a movie with his girlfriend. Upon coming home, after having a conversation with a neighbor at his apartment, they decide to go out to have a picnic at the beach. And in the course of the picnic at the beach, the main character gets in an argument with an Arabic man further down the coastline. It ends up going back and shooting the man for no obviously apparent reason. He's ultimately confronted by the police, taken to jail, sentenced to death. As he's waiting in his cell, considering his execution, which is to come, a priest comes in and asks him, "Don't you want to confess your sins, get right with God?" And the main character shoos him out of there. And then it's over. it seems like the logical place to end the book would at least be with the execution itself. But that's Camus' point. Death is inevitable and escapable, and before it seems like it's upon you, you're already done. It's remarkably dark and pessimistic, but it's something for this time. Carry that understanding of the futility and absurdity of life into our most important text, the myth of Sisyphus. The myth of Sisyphus is usually packaged as the myth of Sisyphus and other essays. And Camus spends about 3/4 to 9/10 of this text analyzing the ethics of suicide. He says the question of suicide is the only important philosophical question. Again, as dark as it comes. And Camus' point is, if life is absurd, pointless, and meaningless, why bother? Why go through with it? Why go on? Why not just end it all and be done with the silliness of it? Why not just off yourself? And the ultimate conclusion that Camus comes to, he provides in the form of the ancient Greek tragic mythological hero, Sisyphus. The story goes that Sisyphus, one way or another, really pissed off the gods, and Zeus in particular. Accounts differ on how. And so Zeus punishes Sisyphus to roll a heavy boulder up a mountain each day for all of eternity. And as soon as he gets it to the top, he watches it roll back down and has to start again. For Camus, this is representative of the futility and absurdity of life. His point being, nothing we can ever do will last. Nothing we can ever accomplish is permanent. All of it will pass away, erode, and fade. And so, if nothing we do is of lasting importance, permanence, or value, why bother? Why put in all the effort and all the energy if ultimately it doesn't matter? If in the end we're dead, if in the end the earth is a hollowed out husk that no one remembers, why try? Why bother? The very best we could hope for in life is that we might, if we so choose, raise children, but then the best end result of that is that we will die before they die, right? And if those children are lucky, they might have children, but their children will die, right? And if they're lucky, they will die before their children die. So if death is so inescapable and nothing lasts, why go on? And the way that Camus answers is in the final sentence of the text, treating the question of suicide. What he says is that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. For Camus, Sisyphus's happiness is as absurd and futile as his punishment itself. In fact, his happiness is a sort of revolt or rebellion against the futility and absurdity of existence. Sisyphus has no reason to be happy. Nothing Sisyphus can accomplish will last. And so Sisyphus has no reason to be happy. But I think Camus' point is that Sisyphus can't control his fate. The gods control his fate. They control his body. They control the world. But what Sisyphus can control is his response to it. Sisyphus's freedom to choose to be happy, even though he has no reason to be, is itself absurd. His existence is absurd. And so, the rational response to an absurd resistance would be depression, pessimism, nihilism, suicide, to lay down and beg the gods to end it all. But instead of giving the gods that satisfaction, Sisyphus instead, for no reason at all but sheer gumption, chooses to be happy, even though he has no reason to. Thus, that happiness is absurd and an absurd rebellion. The way I often have reason to describe Camus' philosophy, a pessimistic, absurd, existentialist one, is that life sucks, then you die. So screw it. Let's go to the beach and have a picnic. At the end of the day, I don't think this is necessarily the worst philosophy. The choice to be happy is a very thin thread connecting Camus, or any of us, to existence. But Camus' point is that may in fact be all we have. The ability to choose to be happy, and to choose to enjoy the sunshine while we're here. I know I personally take a lot of pleasure and honestly find solace in this philosophy. Consider the plight of the philosopher in general, or of the philosopher in our contemporary or geographical context. What in particular can I hope to accomplish? Teaching philosophy in especially conservative areas is not unlike Sisyphus's rock to be pushed uphill just to watch it roll back down. But I do it, and I enjoy it. And I think Camus' absurdity, or absurd reaction to absurdity, his defiant happiness, is a philosophy not of pessimism, but nearly one of optimism, hope. Things may be bad, but we can choose to be happy. And that's a stunning way to end a text about whether or not to kill yourself because life is meaningless. It's just such an incredible juxtaposition. The last text Camus publishes, titled The Rebel, serves as a nice counterpoint to Nietzsche's. Nietzsche's philosophy, we had seen actually, though I didn't emphasize it, was about saying yes to life instead of no to temptation. Camus' philosophy is about the man who says, no, I'm not going to take it, and stands up and fights back for his rights. So, whereas Nietzsche's philosophy emphasizes the person who says yes to pleasure. Camus' philosophy is one who says no to oppression. Those are an interesting pair to put together. I like to contrast Camus with the American author Kurt Vonnegut in a text from around the same time called The Cat's Cradle. Vonnegut tells a sci-fi story about a scientist who invents a new molecular form of water called Ice-9. And this molecular form of water, if you had a little crystal the size of a grain of salt and dropped it into a water bottle, the water bottle would freeze solid at room temperature. If you drop it in a pond, the pond freezes hard as rock and ice in the middle of the summer. And if you drop it in the oceans of the planet all immediately turn to ice. Vonnegut's story goes that this invention, as you might guess, makes it out of the lab and ultimately destroys the world and everyone on it, because you touch the Ice-9 to your tongue and you freeze solid as a rock. And Vonnegut has his last character in his futile existence take a different route than Camus. Vonnegut's scientist, the last man alive, after all of humanity and the entire climate and life on Earth has been destroyed, he climbs up to the top of a nearby mountain, lays down on his back, sticks out his tongue, flips off the gods, and takes the Ice-9, freezing himself in an eternal statue of "up yours" to the deities, who cursed us to this human fate. But notice that Camus' response in Sisyphus is different. Not one of resignation and petulance, but one of obstinate, pointless, chosen happiness. Let's finish out, and thank you for your patience. Thankfully, we can do this all in one go. Our last author to discuss this week is Jean-Paul Sartre, or Sartre. He is an exponent of what's called atheistic existentialism. His purpose in the text titled Existentialism is a Humanism, which I had you read, is to take atheism as a starting point and draw all the necessary logical conclusions from it that would follow. This is the sort of completion of Nietzsche's project. He analyzes the elements of existentialism that we had discussed with our first existentialist author, Soren Kierkegaard. The anxiety, abandonment, meaninglessness, and guilt that existential philosophy expresses. By abandonment, Sartre means simply that we have abandoned God as an idea. We no longer have use for it. And we're living in Nietzsche's world, post-religion. As a consequence of that, life is without meaning, in the sense that there is no God-given meaning to life. But this isn't a pessimistic, nihilistic philosophy. Instead, if there's no God-given meaning, then we are free to create our own. The ability to imbue life with meaning is then ours. And instead of having to be a square peg that doesn't fit in a round hole, we can make of life what we want out of it. And lastly, for Sartre, if there is no God, then our guilt, bad conscience for actions we're ashamed of, is inescapable. Because we can't ask a God to forgive us if there's no God there to get forgiveness from. Thus, we are completely responsible for our own actions. We can analyze these four features of existentialism in Soren Kierkegaard, in Friedrich Nietzsche, in Albert Camus, in Jean-Paul Sartre, whom we're discussing now, and likely also in the feminist author we'll discuss next time, Simone de Beauvoir, and perhaps even in Martin Heidegger, even Ayn Rand, though those last two are not as clear and not as obvious. Sartre's argument is that existentialism has the foundational principle that existence precedes essence, which means that first we exist, and then only afterwards can we define or try to invent our meaning or purpose. And this is the opposite of the purpose of a human invention like a pair of scissors. The purpose for the scissors precedes the existence of the scissors. I think, I need something to cut paper with, and so I make a pair of scissors. But if we are taking atheism as a starting point, then there's no God to have given us purpose, so that we are first something that exists, and then we can attempt to understand why, or invent the meaning for why we choose to exist. That we imbue life with meaning, and we freely decide the purpose we choose to serve. That's what he's expressing in this first quotation. I'll continue on and go through some of the other high points of the text. He says, "Thus there is no human nature, because there is no God to have a conception of it. Man simply is. Not that he is simply what he conceives himself to be, but he is what he wills, and as he conceives himself after already existing, as he wills to be after that leap towards existence. Man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself. That is the first principle of existentialism." I'll just continue on, because these are themes we've already described. He continues by expanding this responsibility for the meaning of our existence beyond the personal to the social. He writes, "If, however, it is true that existence is prior to essence, man is responsible for what he is, as opposed to God being responsible for what we are. Thus, the first effect of existentialism is that it puts every man in possession of himself as he is, and places the entire responsibility for his existence squarely upon his shoulders. And when we say that man is responsible for himself, we do not mean that he is responsible only for his own individuality, but that he is responsible for all men. Both Sartre and the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky question what effect Nietzsche's death of God will have on morality, both of whom questioning if the non-existence of God means that anyone can get away with anything. Sartre's answer, on the contrary, is that if there is no God, we are the only ones responsible for ourselves. We can't blame God. We have no recourse to God. And what we make of humanity is a function purely and solely of our choices. Thus, if we make of humanity something reprehensible, we are at fault, not some devil. And conversely, if we make of humanity something noble, if we manifest that individually and collectively by our actions, that is something we can be proud of, because we chose to make humanity good. No God instituted it in us. Sartre continues, when we say that man chooses himself, we do mean that every one of us must choose himself. But by that we also mean that in choosing for himself, he chooses for all men. For in effect, of all the actions a man may take in order to create himself as he wills to be, there is not one which is not creative at the same time of an image of man as he believes he ought to be. One of the fears of people regarding atheism is the idea that if there's no God watching when no one else is, people will think they can get away with anything. They wouldn't have integrity. That argument already has enough complexity and counter-arguments by itself. But Sartre's response is that every time we act, by our actions, we are representing what we think is good for people to do. That argument ties into what's called authenticity as opposed to inauthenticity, good faith and bad faith. So perhaps let's come back around to that at the end. What's of most relevance, I think, in the text Existentialism is a Humanism, is the example Sartre gives of a student that comes to him seeking advice. Sartre puts it this way. He says, in coming to me, this student knew what advice I would be likely to give him, and I had but one reply to make. You are free, therefore choose. That is to say, invent. No general rule of morality can show you what you ought to do. No signs are vouchsafed in this world. The Catholics will reply, oh, but they are. Very well. Still, it is I myself, in every case, who have to interpret the signs. And he continues with the considerable burden that in every respect I bear the responsibility of the choice which, in committing myself, also commits the whole of humanity. The example in the text is the student wants to know if he should go off to war to fight the Nazis and avenge the death of his brother and father. Or if he should stay with his mother, who is now widowed and lost one son, and he is the only son she has left. He fears if he goes off to war, and especially if he dies, his mother will die of heartbreak. But if he stays home, he will have been a coward, and the Allies might lose if it weren't for him turning the tide of the battle. Thus he goes to Professor Sartre, asking, "What should I do? Tell me. Take the terrible burden of the responsibility of making this choice off of me." But Sartre doesn't let him escape his responsibility, doesn't let him escape or hide from his freedom. Perhaps you've had the experience when you go to someone to ask for advice, but you know what sort of advice you'd like to receive. When we do this, we don't so much want the advice. We want someone else to tell us what we already think. And Sartre explains the reason for that is so that if something goes wrong, we can place the blame on someone other than ourselves. If the young man goes off to war and his mother dies of heartache, he can say, "It's not my fault. I was just doing what Professor told me to do." Or if he stays home, he doesn't have to worry about, "I'm a coward," because he's just doing what his well-respected professor told him to do. These are what Sartre calls inauthentic or bad faith ways of hiding from our freedom and our responsibility. See the responsibility here too. What Sartre says is, I won't let you hide. I won't tell you what to do. It's your choice, and no one can make it but you. He says, you could have gone to a priest, but some priests say it is our duty to fight against evil, and other priests say it is never our duty to commit violence, and that you would go to a priest knowing what sort of advice you wanted to hear, because you already made up your mind. You just want someone else to tell you, so that way you don't have to bear the blame and the burden of the responsibility of the freedom of choice. Sartre finishes by giving the example of a young man who wanted to join the military, but couldn't pass the physical fitness test. And he says, this young man took that as a sign from God that he wasn't meant for worldly success, and instead went and joined the priesthood. But what Sartre explains is that this man could have interpreted that supposed sign in a variety of ways. He could have interpreted it as a sign that he should go do more push-ups and try again. He could have taken it as a sign that he should move to America and become an entrepreneur. Sartre's transcendent point here is that people can claim X, Y, or Z is a sign from God, whether that be a rainbow, a lightning strike, the Bible or the Quran, a fork in the road, a tarot card or psychic reader, a death in the family, or a near miss on the road. People say it's a sign from God, or surviving a disease. But what Sartre says is that no one can tell for sure what the meaning of that sign is. In every single instance, in everything from the Bible and the Quran to a near miss on the road, we are the ones who determine the meaning of those signs. And nothing can tell for sure that it is indeed an omen from God, unambiguously, with certainty. And that when we see a Bible, a Quran, when we see a person miraculously healed, we have the freedom and the responsibility to interpret what the meaning of those events are. There is nothing that says perfectly, beyond the shadow of a doubt, this could only have been God. If we choose to take it that way, that is a choice, and nothing other than our choice, which others might make differently. And so, even the supposed existence of miracles is not so certain that it couldn't be interpreted in some other way. Sartre presents a thoroughgoing atheism. But in doing so, he retains a personal responsibility ethic that it would be all too easy to lose sight of. But for Sartre, if there are no gods and no devils, there is only us that ends up being responsible for what we do or don't do in this life. And thus, no one to blame, but also no one else that deserves the credit if we make of our life something great or fail to. Now, Sartre could be right or wrong on that in a variety of ways, but that is the philosophy he expresses, one of atheism, that life is for us to imbue with meaning, and that with that comes the terrible but joyous burden of responsibility. And I think that's a good place to call it quits. Next week is our last lecture. Well done if you've made it this far.